Inside this broken submarine, skeletal remains are still there, in some cases with tattered bits of uniform or boots with a leg jutting out. It was incredibly sobering. Because it was so deep and they couldn't see much, there was a little bit of an argument. And although his brain was numb with narcosis, he thought he saw a torpedo. At the conclusion of that dive, we all started saying, well, how did this Nazi U-boat wind up off of Atlantic City, New Jersey, and no one knows? Neither the United States government, federal German government, no historian, none of the authors that had written books on German U-boat operations, and no expert could answer the simple question, what submarine was this and why was it off New Jersey? We would spend 5 years of our lives and marriages, our youth, and our sanity to try and figure that out. It would be the second trip out to this wreck site when, tragically, the shipwreck took the first of 3 lives. He ran into trouble, became pinned inside the wreck, and his father had to try and unbury him from the debris that had fallen on him. And by the time they came out, they were dreadfully low on air.
Special thanks to Frank Bodenschatz, Alan Mays, Michael Larson, and Dan Kono. They received early access to this video by becoming History X Bronze members. If you like shipwrecks, Richie Kohler is going to join us tonight. You may recognize him as one of the deep sea detectives from the History Channel, and he is going to give us a little bit of the background story behind his identification of the German sub, the U-869. So I'm thrilled to have him on. Let me introduce some of the other guys. John from the USS Slater, upper left-hand corner. Shane from the Buffalo Naval Park, upper right. And then Connor Kilgore, bottom right, from the Transportation Museum of Thunder Bay. And then, like I said a few moments ago, Richie Kohler joining us. His background, he's originally out of Brooklyn, New York, recreational diver who kind of learned the ropes from other experienced divers in the 1990s, kind of like the Wild West when it came to wreck diving. So he learned a lot from other experienced divers, eventually started exploring the Andrea Doria, and with the help of some friends, came across the site of the U-boat 869, and it was made popular by a Nova broadcast called Hitler's Lost Sub. That's how I originally heard of this story. It was fascinating. I loved it. And then a best-selling book called Shadow Divers by an author by the name of Robert Kurson. Fantastic book. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I read it when it first came out, read it again recently, and the book still holds up because it's a fascinating, fascinating story. Matter of fact, at the end, if you want to read this book, if you want to grab a copy of it, there is a link in the description below on the History X channel. Click on that. It'll take you right to it. I'm just thrilled to have you here, first of all. If you ever said I would have been talking to Richie Kohler from the History Channel, I was like, why would that ever be possible? So thank you for joining us.
No, pleasure to be here. You know, listening to you tell my story, it's been a crazy ride that literally started with the discovery of this unknown shipwreck, which at first, when it was discovered in 1991 by Captain Bill Nagle and the crew of the Seeker, that boat that's on screen right now, everybody on board were amateur divers. They were plumbers, electricians, mostly blue-collar guys that worked their job 9 to 5, and on the weekend would pack a lunch and go out on boats just like this to go out into the Atlantic Ocean and dive shipwrecks. A select few would plunk their money down on gambles to go out and find virgin shipwrecks. And I wasn't on that trip when the Seeker went out with a full crew to go out and look at an unknown target on the bottom. Sometimes these things are just rocks, sometimes they're old barges, but Labor Day of 1991, they stumbled on what was arguably the remains of a World War II shipwreck. Because it was so deep and the conditions turbid and they couldn't see much, there was a little bit of an argument. Some people thought it might have been a barge. But one person, John Chatterton, had seen what he believed to be an angled hatch And although his brain was numb with narcosis, that's John right there, he thought he saw a torpedo inside it. Now, when they came back, the first thing they did was they started looking in a lot of the guidebooks and historical references to shipwrecks off the coast of New Jersey, and there was no submarine lost in this area. So what John had seen, a lot of people ridiculed. It would be the second trip out to this wreck site when two things would happen. First would be that the visibility was a little bit better, and John was able to confirm it was absolutely a submarine. Its nationality unknown, but tragically the shipwreck took the first of what would be 3 lives over the 6 years it took us to identify it. Steve Feldman was diving on the wreck when he experienced some kind of difficulty and passed out underwater. It would be months before his body would be recovered. That's really where I come into this story, because I hadn't been party to those first 2 dives. But with the death of Steve Feldman, a lot of people realized that this wreck was dangerous. It was deeper than what they had been diving. This was a time when technology was pretty much unchanged from when Jacques Cousteau introduced us to scuba diving. Everybody was breathing air. They were just using scuba tanks on their back. There were no diving computers. There was no mixed gases. There was nothing that we use today that would have made these dives any safer. And so I got a call from one of the members of the crew that said, "Hey, we're going back out to this mystery submarine. Would you like to come?" And I said, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing I lived for at that point.
How old were you at the time?
I was just about 29 years old.
And you'd been diving since you were a teenager?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, before that, when I was 9 years old, my dad introduced me to scuba diving in the beautiful waters of Brooklyn, New York, which is where we lived at the time. But one of the things that's kind of humorous about this adventure is that at the same time that the Apollo space program was going off, Neil Armstrong's walking on the moon, my dad took scuba diving lessons, brought me with him, and I sat at the edge of the pool. And for this little kid from Brooklyn, as I watched my dad disappear beneath the surface of the pool, pulling that double regulator over his head, it wasn't hard for me to imagine that he was like an astronaut. And so I realized at a young age, I may never become an astronaut, but I could become an aquanaut. And so my dad has always been the kind of father that enabled his children to do things, to touch things, to try things, whether it was a chainsaw, a shotgun, skill saw, working, driving motorcycles, whatever it was, he enabled us. And so he strapped that tank on me when I was 9 years old and tied a rope around my back and allowed me to go right off the back of our boat in the harbor, literally at the dock. And that was my first exposure at 9 years old to scuba diving. At 15 years old, I was now old enough to become certified, and I've been diving literally, with the exception of 2 years when I had some family issues going on. I've been diving every year ever since.
You were kind of brought into this group of divers that were doing things that wasn't common practice.
That is fair to say. So in 1980, I graduated high school. I moved back to New York, and I fell in with a group of older fellows, and they were doing dives that were way outside of the limit of sport diving. These were dives that were giving them the nickname the thugs or the crazies, because when dive boats would go out, these guys wanted to stay down longer or go deeper. To give you an idea, at that time, the sport diving limit in 1980, which was widely accepted, was 130 feet. And this group was regularly diving deeper than 200 feet. And the problem when you go deeper and breathe air is that you suffer something called narcosis, which is a debilitating effect that is akin to getting drunk. As you can probably imagine, when you've got a finite breathing supply and you're weaving yourself into broken ships, traveling inside them at great depth with the clock ticking, being drunk's not a good idea. But yet, with experience and patience and working your way up to it, these guys took me under their wing. They taught me how to use more advanced equipment, like looking at in these pictures, dry suits rather than wetsuits. So we were adapting commercial technology and commercial diving equipment for sport diving. And we operated as a team. Although they were nicknamed the crazies or the thugs, we eventually adapted a much more respectable name, which was the Atlantic Wreck Divers. And when people question me and say, why were you going deep? Well, the reality is that a lot of the shipwrecks that had been located off the New York and New Jersey shore in the 70s had already been dived extensively by the early divers in the 60s and 70s. So for us to find prized artifacts like ship's bells or portholes or crockery, we actually had to go further offshore and deeper. There's many experiences you can have diving, whether you love the interaction of marine life, just the feeling of weightlessness. But I have to tell you that of all of the experiences, one of the things that to this day keeps me diving is that feeling when you go down the anchor line and you know for a fact you're the first person to see this ship. You're the first one that has found something that has been lost. And all shipwrecks that are naturally occurring, meaning not the ones that are sunk on purpose, they're surrounding drama and tragedy. You know, a shipwreck by its very nature is a tragic event. And quite often there's great loss of life. And each one of these stories is a unique dive into the past, whether it's a ship that was sunk in an act of war, a collision, or a storm. When you're pulling yourself down that anchor line and you see it, that whole story plays out right in front of your mind. When you're decompressing and coming back up, it plays over and over in your mind's eye. And all you want to do is get back.
And let me ask you about going down that anchor line, because, again, this is the 1990s. GPS was just getting started at the time.
Didn't exist. Now, we were using Loran A and Loran C.
And getting to wrecks that hadn't been located yet. The beginning of Shadow Divers, which that's this book right here. The link is in the description below the video. They talk about kind of like a clandestine meeting. Bill Nagle, who built the Seeker, all of this stuff was kind of kept secret. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, Bill ran a commercial dive boat, which basically means that he was making a living taking scuba divers to shipwrecks. And so if he was able to steal customers away from other dive boats by telling them, hey, I've got this new shipwreck, he basically traded numbers or locations for an inshore shipwreck with a fisherman for this offshore virgin shipwreck. So that trade with a gentleman named Skeets is the impetus for this entire adventure. And some of the people, it wasn't about artifacts. For some of the people, it might be just to go and take pictures and be somewhere that no one else has ever been. For some of the people, it was about collecting lobsters or scallops or shooting fish. So every diver had a different reason, but everybody loved the opportunity to go to the path less traveled. And again, it was becoming in the 90s rarer to have that experience because we were kind of limited to a depth of about 200 or 250 feet by the equipment and the technology that we were using back then. And so without being able to go any deeper, we've kind of hit a wall, and that wall was a depth limit of how far we could go. And the Submarine, that is the subject of the book Shadow Divers, was literally dangling on that edge of where it was safe to dive and where air becomes poisonous. And you can either die of carbon dioxide poisoning, oxygen poisoning, or you can do something stupid because you're suffering from nitrogen narcosis. So it's the very gas that you need to survive at the same way can kill you.
History X membership has its privileges. To access unedited versions of this and many other History X videos, consider becoming a History X member. When you were invited to join up on these trips to dive on and try and figure out what it was, because you had said at the time John Chatterton thought he had seen a torpedo, but you said there was also maybe a little bit of narcosis going on. What did you think it was?
At the time, I didn't doubt John that it was a submarine, but John believed it was a World War II U-boat. And there were no U-boats listed as being sunk off the coast of New Jersey. But there was an American submarine that was lost. It was the USS Spikefish. It was an American submarine that was decommissioned and being towed from Philadelphia up to Maine, and it broke its tow and sank in bad weather and wound up being located by members of the Atlantic wreck divers off of eastern Long Island, New York, roughly about 60 miles maybe from this U-boat. It's in the vicinity. So I believed it was the USS Spikefish. And so I was being a little pragmatic and thinking, well, if you think it's a submarine, well, there's an American submarine that had been lost, and it must be that submarine. And so when I went diving the wreck on that third trip after Steve Feldman had died, and that's actually me on my first dive, I was looking to find an artifact, and I'm actually holding an artifact in my hand there, that would have American writing on it. I was just looking for anything that said made in Chicago, anything like that, which would conclusively prove that this was a World War II American submarine that had been lost. But on that very dive, in the after compartment of the submarine, and I'm holding to be a canteen, John Chatterton was entering the forward end of the submarine, and he found some crockery. This occurred on the second dive of the day, and the weather had been very rough. And only 2 divers made that second dive that day, myself and John Chatterton. And so as I ascended up the line, John Chatterton was above me, and I could see in his mesh bag that he had found some crockery. I could see the white bowls, the bone white china. I ascended a little bit, and I, to this day, still recall how incredibly excited I was when I spun the bag around and I saw exactly what you have on screen. I saw the eagle and the swastika with the year 1942, and I was totally electrified. I'm like, what is this? This doesn't make sense. This is not supposed to be here. And it started a fever to be the men to identify it, because it was truly an enigma. At the conclusion of that dive, we all went home. We all went to our libraries and started saying, well, how did this submarine, fall through the cracks? How did a Nazi U-boat wind up off of Atlantic City, New Jersey, and no one knows? So over that winter of 91, 92, we reached out to different experts. We contacted the U.S. Navy. We contacted the German Navy, their naval attaché based in New York City. And we came away with the fact that neither the United States government, federal German government, no historian, and no expert, none of the authors that we could contact that had written books on German U-boat operations could answer the simple question, what submarine was this and why was it off New Jersey? We would then spend literally the next 5 years of our lives and dedicate treasure and marriages, our youth, and our sanity to try and figure that out.
Were you married at the time?
I was, and when the first fatality occurred, I wasn't on the trip. But in the third year of diving the wreck, there was a father and son team, Chris and Chrissy Rouse, that had come out with us, and they were very accomplished divers. And Chrissy was the son. He was positive he was going to go in there and find something that would identify the wreck. And on one of his dives inside, he ran into trouble. I'm not going to dedicate too much time going into the effect of what happened, but he basically became pinned inside the wreck, and his father had to try and unbury him from the debris that had fallen on him. As I mentioned earlier, you only have a finite amount of breathing gas or air in your cylinders, and by the time they came out, they were dreadfully low on air. They had more complications. They lost the line, the anchor line, and they tried to make a free ascent. And it was just one bad thing after another happened to them until finally they made a decision to come to the surface. And as many of your viewers who may know something about scuba diving, you can't simply just come to the surface at these depths. You have to do something called decompression. If you don't do your decompression, if you come straight to the surface, you can suffer a malady that is called the bends, or decompression sickness, from coming up and not allowing the bubbles in your blood to dissipate through normal respiration over a period of time. And so the Rouses came right to the surface. And Chris, the father, made sure that we got his son on board the boat before he died, literally in mine and John Chatterton's arms, on the back of the boat, on the ladder as we were trying to carry him up. His son fought for hours, ultimately would die hours later at a hospital. He had been evacuated by Coast Guard helicopter, but you can't alleviate or get rid of that much decompression and not have an extreme detrimental effect, whether it would be paralysis, brain damage, or in the case of Chrissy, his young heart just could not handle the stress of what the decompression sickness had done to him. He passed. So after that, this wreck in 3 years, took 3 divers. It started to stress my marriage. At the point I had 2 small children, and my wife did not understand why I wasn't diving with my friends, the Atlantic wreck divers, and having fun. What was it about this Nazi submarine that had me under its spell? At the time, I had difficulty answering it. Now, 30 years later, I could look you in the eye and say, well, life gives us opportunities, and sometimes we don't recognize them for what they are at the moment. And this submarine was an opportunity for John and I to do something. At the beginning of this adventure, I just wanted another bit of memorabilia. I wanted another artifact. I wanted a dish with the East sticker to put with all the other artifacts that I had from shipwrecks in my earlier career. And what happened is my outlook changed, because inside this broken submarine, unlike any other shipwreck that I had dove before, you could clearly see the remains of the 56-man crew. And it was incredibly sobering. To give you an example, I had made many dives on the Andrea Doria, and there had been 50 fatalities on that, but you don't see the remains of the victims. They've been absorbed by the sea. But inside of the submarine, in the still water, the skeletal remains are still there. In some cases, with tattered bits of uniform or boots with a leg jutting out. And I don't know what it would say about me or my morality to be a person who would enter such a site and not be affected by it, when other people that I would talk to would go, well, they were Nazis, you know, they were the enemy. And I understood that in 1945, I would have probably been on an American destroyer, and I would have dropped depth charges on them and kill them because they were the enemy. But in 1991 and 92, 93, 94, they were lost souls. They were soldiers who fought their battle, they died, and no one knew where they were or who they were. And that haunted me. It haunted me to think that these men somewhere in the world had family, whether it was mothers or fathers, most likely brothers, sisters, children, wives, that didn't know where they were and what happened. And so I felt a personal sense of responsibility to solving this mystery. And my wife didn't understand that. Not that she didn't understand the concept behind it, she didn't understand risking my life to do it. So that would create stress. I had a business at the time, and of course, when Bill Nagle would call me up, hey, the weather's looking good, I would take off work. I'd close my shop, because the good weather days that we could get out to this submarine were far and few. And of course, this was another area that would cause difficulty with me and my wife, and of course, my business associates and customers and stuff like that. But I felt compelled. There was no book, Shadow Divers. There was no Hitler's Lost Sub. There was no reward for doing this. There was just the feeling in my heart that this was the right thing to do.
When you first go down there on your first trip out there and you see features like this, and you already have an idea that it was an American submarine.
That's correct. The shape of it and the limited visibility, and with narcosis, you just kind of try to focus on small features, not the big picture. The big picture you put together over a series of dives, or you do it by collecting photographs like the ones you're showing right now. You take these photographs and you kind of piece them together, and then you compare them to historic photographs. But at the time that you're diving, we go into the water with preconceived notions, and we are hoping that our assumptions are correct. And on that third dive, as I ascended, I was still convinced it was an American submarine until I turned that bag around and I saw the dishes with the swastika, and I was totally floored. So,
how much time are you able to spend down there?
Back in '91, when we were diving air, we would stay down for a maximum of about 20 minutes, of which it would take you about 3 to 5 minutes to swim down. And then it would take you about 90 minutes to 2 hours to come back up and do your decompression. So you couldn't just swim back up. You had to spend about 90 minutes to 2 hours of these decompression stops to ascend safely to the surface.
Coming up in part 2.
One of the divers slapped John on the back and said, "You've solved the mystery, John. All you have to do is find Hornberg, and now you know." Well, easier said than done. Of the 40,000 men who served on German submarines, there was only one named Hornberg.
Continue on to part 2 of this history exploration of Hitler's lost sub, the U-869, with deep sea detective Richie Kohler.